My name is John Charles Yoshinobu Seishavarel, and I was born in 1992 to a Christian family. The reason I say my full name is because over the last 24 years, that incredibly short time with which I have had life, each of those names has come to mean a great deal to me in a great many ways, and so I thought, as I share my story with you all, um, as we get to know each other in the way that Christ has moved in, through, and with us over the course of our lives, I would do so in the context of my name, who I am. So let's start with the first, John, after my father. Of all the names I have, this one's the one I'm called the most, of course, but also I think the one I've had the most directly contentious relationship with. It's the link that connects me to my dad. Uh, we don't look anything alike. My dad's a short, bald Asian man. I'm a tall, nerdy white guy. Uh, my dad drinks, smokes, and gambles. I do none of these things. Um, on the surface, we're very, very different people. His relationship with God and mine have taken, however, in many ways, a very similar path. And once you get below the surface, once you start to look deeper, there's a great deal of similarity between me and my father. I think the greatest difference between us isn't our appearance, but our context. I grew up in a stable home. My father did not. I grew up with consistent food, shelter, clothing, clean water, and a loving family. My dad did not. Um, I had moral touchstones in my life to show me what was right and wrong. My father had to figure those things out for himself, but I think at the end of the day, there's more in common than most people realize. For both of us, are prideful men. We don't like to give up control easily. We like to know as much about what is around us as we can. We both work hard, and we see the fruit of our labor and articulate it sometimes in a spiritual sense. Both of us relax in very similar ways. Both of us have had similar sins, similar virtues. Hardworking, if we call it a virtue, but also patience with others, a virtue I've grown to have to some degree. Caring in our own way, and protectiveness of those around us. We're both also prideful, lustful, um, and too easily swayed by the people around us. My relationship with my father came to a head when it was found out he had an affair when I was a junior in high school. And a lot, but previous to that point, I had looked up to him uh, as much as a person can look up to another at that age. Um, but after his affair and his leave takings from my family, my relationship with him became strained. We had to work together. I worked for him at Takaoka of Japan, where he was the manager. Uh, but he became more of a boss with whom I was very distant and somewhat, unfortunately, cold. Although never publicly, never was never a fool enough to anger or confront my father in public in any way. Um, We remained distant for about a year, at which point it's necessary to get into my second name, Charles, after my father's best friend, who killed himself a few months before I was born. John Charles Lamb. He and my father had been inseparable since they were about 11 years old. And after he died, I'm told my father was quite different. That there was a marked break between John C. Shefferle in March 1991 and John C. Shefferle in May of 1991. Now, why that's important is because the winter after I graduated high school, one of my best friends from high school also committed suicide. In a somewhat similar fashion, under somewhat similar circumstances. And in both cases, we had been one of the last people that our friends had reached out to. Now that doesn't mean that we're culpable in some way, that we are guilty of their deaths. They made the choice that they made. And all the consequences of that wrought are on them. But I don't think there's any sugarcoating. I don't think there's any way to get around it. They deserved better friends. And both my father and I, we let them down. And they're dead. And there's nothing we can do about that. But that brought us closer. My father, I didn't tell him immediately. But my telling him was probably the mending to that. And that name, Charles, what that began to mean to me, I reflected a great deal on what it meant to be a friend. And I felt that I had been utterly and completely inadequate in that respect. To be more careful with the people around me, to try and notice things about them, changes in them, protect them as best as I was able. I feel like God used that terrible, terrible, terrible thing, and He offered it up as an opportunity for me to learn. And while I have learned incompletely and inadequately, I think I have, to some degree, internalized the need to be a good friend, a good brother, and a good son, and to watch for those things. And also it taught me the value of life, that after he died, it was never more clear to me that that was not an option. That in desperate times a man can do many desperate things, and I've done some of them. But suicide, not when I've seen what it's left behind and been a part of what's left behind. That's not an option for me anymore. I have to live for as long as I'm able, and to die as best I can. So that brings us back to my first name, John. What does that come to mean to me? Means that, at least as far as I can see, as far as I know, I have to be a good son. Charles taught me how to be a friend. John taught me how to be a son. And in turn, how to be a father. Not just to children, if I ever have any, which may never happen, I don't know, but to the young people around me, who I know so often don't have a father figure to look up to, a male role model to have, to try and in some small way, oftentimes only for a brief moment in time, to be that person. I remember when I was in track in high school at Southside, the track coach brought us all, Coach Nolan, he brought us all together. There's probably 50 or 60 of us. And he had us all raise our hands, and every single person there raised their hands. It might have been about 40 people. And we all raised our hands. And he says, everyone here who knows who their father is, drop your hands. And it had to be close to half of us dropped our hands. And he says, everyone here, that was the people who didn't know who their father was. They dropped their hands, about 40-50%. And then people here who have lived with their father, drop your hands. And several other people dropped their hands. They said, people here who live, or who have never lived with their father, sorry. People here who don't live with their father now, drop your hands. And at this point, there's only a few of us remaining. And people here who love your father, he said, keep your hands up. And me and Kyle Fenstermacher were the only two people on the track team to keep our hands up that day. I'll never forget that. So if there's some way I can be a positive influence to the younger men around me, the way my father was to me, even in spite of his many flaws, that's something that I feel called upon to do as best as I'm able. Yoshinobu is my middle name. I'm named after a long dead shogun. Long story, it's not important, but the point is that name has come to mean something to me in recent years, maybe the last 6 years or so. I don't look Asian at all. I'm like a fourth Japanese, to the point it doesn't really matter. I don't speak very well in Japanese. I don't act particularly Japanese, but when I think of Japan, less than 2% of people in Japan are Christian. And that bothers me on a fundamental level. Irrationally, in a way, I understand that. There's certainly other places that need spiritual ministry and so on that I don't feel, I'll be honest, I don't feel as particularly invested in them as I do in Japan, because even places where I've known people from almost everywhere around the world. Having worked at Takaoka, I've worked with people from Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, China, Korea, Japan, Iran, Pakistan, Mexico, Guatemala, even some Americans. And with all those people, and I'm probably missing a country or two in there somewhere, who I've learned to become friends with, and I've spent time with them. I've gone out with them. I've, been friends, and I have a certain bias towards Japan, in the sense that I want to go there. I want to be there. I want to be what little help one person, particularly as one as incalculably incapable as I am, could be. But that brings me to, interestingly, one of the great difficulties in my life doing ministry, and in my calling towards becoming a minister in a professional sense, whatever that means. The verse in Luke where Jesus says that anyone who does not hate their mother or father is unworthy of being my disciple. That's hard for me. I think of what I'm going to have to leave behind, and I feel as if, whether it's for a short time or a long time, The price that I pay, there's always a price. And at least one of them will be a separation from my family. I've never had many friends outside of blood. One of the few that I have had is dead, and losing that connection, my mom, my dad, brother, sister, my grandmother, my uncle Danny, going somewhere else away from them. It hasn't happened yet, but I feel that when it does, it's going to hurt. And I don't want to, and I cling to almost any excuse not to go, to stay here, to train more, to find something else productive, something else that will be helpful so that I can pretend that I don't have to do something that I know I have to. But then you go back to those verses where God says that He's first. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. Loving your neighbor as yourself comes second to that. So that's a little bit of what Yoshinobu has come to mean to me, and a little bit of the struggles I've had with that name. When I think of the number of Christians who were killed in Japan during the persecution during the Tokugawa regime, which lasted about 250 years. Forgive me, I needed a drink. I'm moved when I think of all those in Japan who have no foundation in Christ and who lack that truth and that salvation and that hope. I want to be a witness to that hope, that salvation, and that truth. When I think of my sister, what if she got married? And yeah, I was there at the wedding, but that was the first time I met her husband. I miss out on all those key moments that otherwise I could be there for. My grandmother's getting old. My grandpa died already. And yeah, I fly back for the funeral. But I wasn't there in the last moments, days and weeks. Even being here, I've missed so much. And I'm terrified of what I lose when I go. Bible always talks about the solace that we find in Christ and in God. And that's so true. I don't want to pretend that it's not, but one of my many failures is that oftentimes I see the solace as being external from myself, while the mountain of duty is something that is buried on my back. And my final name, C. Cheverell, it's my family name, obviously, and there have been many C. Sheffels, God help us, but the one that I knew the best, Calvin Eugene C. Sheffel Jr., my grandfather. Man, he was a crazy old man. He, growing up, I did not like my grandfather. I did not like spending time with him or ever wanted to be around him when I was young. When they first came back, they lived in Florida for a while. When they first came back around 2001, I found him scary. I was 9 at the time. And he cursed. No one in my family cursed very often. My father would from time to time, but not like Grandpa Cork. He could curse up a storm, and he'd yell, like you wouldn't imagine, uh, make fun of me, you know, all the time. I did not like that. I didn't want to be around that. For about the first year that he was there, I mostly ignored him or found ways to avoid him. But I'd spend every Friday night at their house, and every Saturday morning I'd get up around 6 o'clock in the morning. This was my custom, and the only person who would be awake was Grandpa Cork, and I would avoid him. And that was something that was unacceptable to him, because if he couldn't see me, he didn't know what I was doing. And he didn't want to have to get up to find out, because that's a lot of work. And you don't make an old man work. So he'd make me sit with him. He'd sit on the chair, I'd sit on the couch. Now we'd sit there and we'd watch old movies. I've watched more old westerns than I can shake a stick at. I don't know who started them, I don't know what their names are, but about every Saturday I'd sit there for 3 hours and we'd watch old westerns, maybe an old war movie, but yeah, it used to happen around. I didn't learn to appreciate that until later, but I got to know him a little bit. He was a good man, but not in the way most people see good men. Most people would never look past the cursing or the smoking, the marijuana or the general inability to do anything. They just see a broken old soldier who never moved past a war he didn't believe in or care for the family that loved him. And even when I got to know him as a teenager, middle school, in high school, I didn't see much past that either. After he died, I didn't know what to do. Didn't think it would affect me very much, but it did. I'm just some crazy old man, but it seemed like nothing could kill him. He had 13 heart attacks, including the one that finally did him in, and there didn't seem to be anything special about that last one until it killed him. And I'd sit around the house a lot. I'd clean, or I'd just listen to my grandmother talk about him. You don't realize the depth of a person, I think, until you get to see them outside of your own perspective of them. I knew him when he was already broken. After the war, taken his psyche, had taken his health. And everything that happened in between those things, the drugs and the violence, I'd left him a shell of what he'd been. When you see something in its context, and you're able to see how far he'd come, what he'd done, and what made him cling to life so long, because any one of those 13 heart attacks could have done him in if he'd have let it. Because at some point you stay alive by the sheer willpower, because you want to live, and if you're a man like my grandfather, you don't care. You're not afraid of death. Something else has to propel you to live in that kind of physical agony that I can only begin to understand. And that something was her, was his wife, my grandmother, his children, was me. I never realized he liked having me around, but he did. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Sacrificial love, right? We love because Christ loved us. But it takes a lot. It takes a lot to die. And I've never done it. I've never given my life for something else. So I won't speak soundly here, but I can say that it takes a lot to live. It takes a lot of courage, not just for one moment or for one instant, but it takes courage every bloody day. That's what my grandfather taught me. Now, he didn't do it well, he didn't do it with any particular sense of grace, but he lived. It wasn't convenient for him, it wasn't helpful for him, but he lived. He lived because he wanted to continue to see us graduate from high school or to accomplish things, and because he knew that so long as he lived, we would continue to get the support from the government for his disabilities. He knew that if he lived, it would be better for us, even if it hurt for him, and that kind of love counts for an awful lot. And I am not going to pretend that I have the courage of my grandfather, but I have the example of him. And so as I look back at my story, I hope someday to become a man that he can say that he's proud of. To become the man that can say that he helped the people of some of his ancestors. To become the man that won't do what Charles did, but helped those in Charles's place. To become the man that my dad can look at and say that I've learned from his mistakes and I've pushed our family forward just like he pushed his family forward towards God, towards love, and towards each other. So that's a bit of who I am. There's other things. I think one more thing to mention before I go here. It doesn't have to do with my name, but probably it was important to this sort of story, and that's why I got into ministry in the first place. Long story short, I was going to be in the military. Grandfather's in the military, and as the last 27 minutes have indicated, I respected him a great deal, but I got hurt. No military, no more sports, no more, at least for the time, martial arts or anything else that I was particularly interested in. So I spent a long time alone in my basement, not doing anything for the first at least 3 weeks. I mostly just sat there. I'd love to say I prayed the whole time, but I didn't. I'd love to say I meditated, but I didn't. Or read the Bible, but I didn't. Mostly I just sat there. Sure, some psychologists would have came in and diagnosed me with depression, but there weren't any there. Sat there in the darkness, waiting for it to stare back at me, I guess. And, anyway, after about 3 weeks, I started reading a little more of my Bible, meditating a little more, praying a little more, doing a little more, I guess. And somewhere along the way, I figured I'd serve God. I figured whatever that meant, I wanted something that gave me some kind of meaning, some kind of purpose to do something. And I didn't know that was going to lead me into ministry or to graduate school or to a mission field, but that was where it started. I'm running out of time, and I'm going to cut it off here. May God bless and keep you. May He walk forward to protect you. May be above you to watch over you, beneath you to sustain you, and with you wherever you go. Grace and peace be with you all.